Hi, everyone, and welcome to OT Echo. I am Kate Barlow, the founder and host for today's meeting. It's January 11th, 2024, and today Dr. Quinn Tyminski is here to talk about her activity card sort, Advancing Inclusive Participation. Please mute yourself during the presentation and feel free to type any questions you might have into the chat box, and I will interrupt Quinn to get your questions answered. And if you stay on for the remainder of the presentation, you will receive a certificate of attendance. So thank you so much for being here and making occupational therapy important to you and continuing your lifelong learning. But Quinn, thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to have you here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I am so honored to be able to speak to you all about the amazing assessment that a group of OT researchers and practitioners and clients and I worked together to pull together and get out for everyone. So we will go ahead and get started without further ado. Right. So session objectives. So our plan today, I really want to talk about the role of occupational therapy working with those who are unhoused. That is sort of my bread and butter. That is where this assessment was born out of, though we are not going to relegate the assessment solely to this population, but we're going to talk about why this sort of evolved out of this population and where it's headed. We're going to articulate the ways that we can use this assessment with our clients. What do we use it for? Why would we want to use it with a certain client? And then be able to generate a plan to address non-sanctioned occupational participation in your practice. And so that's really the bread and butter of what we're going to be talking about today. So here we go. So talking about homelessness, there are about 1.6 billion people annually across the globe who are experiencing homelessness or who are unhoused. And I'm going to pause here for a second and talk for just a brief moment about terminology. So homelessness and being unhoused are similar terms. Sort of the culturally sensitive, more appropriate term lately seems to be unhoused. The reason for that, the purpose people like to use unhoused is because people say they may have a home, but they may not have a house, meaning a home has sort of emotions attached to it. In my conversations with clients and my conversations with practitioners who work in this, the use of unhoused versus homeless doesn't seem to be a huge distinction, though person first language does. And so you will hear me throughout this presentation talk about individuals experiencing homelessness, talking about it being a temporary state rather than their personality or their identity. And so for us and for the clients that we work with, it's really more about differentiating them from their sort of context of being unhoused or being homeless, rather than the term homeless or unhoused, if that makes sense. So just to give you a little bit of update on terminology as we go through this. So we know that there's a lot of reasons for someone to become unhoused or homeless. Poverty, generational poverty is certainly one of the main predictors. So individuals who live in generational poverty, who are living in unstably housed conditions through many generations, are easily able to become without a home because of, one missed paycheck, one medical expense that may result in that. Certainly is something we may see in particularly the United States, where we have to pay for our healthcare, forceful evictions, and then just certainly systems and structures. And this is something we are going to see more and more as we see climate change result in forced migration, forcing people out of their homes, having to move. We are also going to see it as a result of conflict. So, everything that we're seeing going on globally right now is absolutely going to result in increased numbers of people being unhoused. And then anytime a government changes the amount of assistance or services they provide, we're going to see an increased number of individuals who are unhoused. So that number is always in flux. And there's a lot of sort of variables to it that we'll talk through, but it is important to note that I think that we are going to see an increase in homelessness in the future, and that this is not an issue that is going away. It is an issue that has become even more into the forefront of our practice. So it is not always driven by substance use and mental illness. I think that is a huge misconception. There is sort of I like to say a chicken and the egg sort of situation. Sometimes there is mental illness or there is substance use that contributes to someone becoming unhoused. The substance use may result in someone losing all social connections, losing all occupations in which they're able to support themselves financially, same with the mental illness. Or it may be, we've done a lot of studies with individuals who are experiencing homelessness, particularly related to some of their occupations like sleep. And they talk about using substances to fall asleep. So there may be sort of a necessary component to substance use that allows them to fully participate in their lives as a result of this. So we sort of want to get away from that stigma of everyone who is unhoused has substance use and has a mental illness concern, but that is not necessarily true. There may be some, it may be, if there is, it may be purposeful, it may be necessary for them to be able to function in their current context, or those things may not be true at all. We do want to talk about young people being at the highest risk of being unhoused. Particularly, we see really high rates of people who are unhoused in the LGBTQ plus community, particularly in different societies where LGBTQ plus lifestyles are not supported. So individuals who are LGBTQ plus may be shunned from their families and then have no place else to go. And then we also know that if you're LGBTQ plus, that a lot of the shelters and a lot of the organizations that serve people who are unhoused are not designed to also serve individuals who are LGBTQ plus, particularly people who present gender differences than their biological sex. And so people often feel the need to present their biological gender in the shelter in order to preserve their safety. And so they aren't able to present their full identity. So that's not where we're going today, but certainly I can have a much longer conversation. And actually, we're just at the end of some research around the occupations of individuals who are LGBTQ plus and also experiencing homelessness. So we've been learning a lot about that. So definitions of homelessness. So the reason that the definitions matter is because the definitions are what allow individuals to seek services. If you're not meeting the definition, then you are uneligible for a lot of the services that are offered. So particularly in the United States, where I'm practicing, the definitions are very strict and they're very limited. And in places like Europe and in Canada, the definitions are a little bit broader and people actually can receive services for being homeless before they become unhoused. So they're more unstably housed as opposed to full on living on the streets or in a shelter, and they can get those services. So it sort of prevents some of that trauma and that harm that comes from someone getting onto, getting in the streets. So this is from the Global Homeless Framework, and they sort of identify three main categories. So this is global. We're not just looking at a specific country here. People without accommodations, people living in temporary or crisis accommodations. So that's things like a shelter. That does often include domestic violence shelters. So individuals who are fleeing domestic violence do count as being unhoused under these regulations. And then people living in severely inadequate or insecure housing. And so that is also essential to know. We tend to, like, when we think about homelessness, we're thinking about a shelter, we're thinking about somebody living in a bridge or an underpass, but you do meet the definitions of homelessness if you're sleeping on someone's couch. Sometimes we call that a doubled up situation, staying with a friend, things like that. Those do technically meet the definitions of being unhoused. So in terms of OT, it's really important for us to recognize chronic homelessness because there's acute homelessness and there's chronic. Acute homelessness is someone who is living at or near the poverty level, who doesn't have a lot of savings, and they experience a job loss. They experience a medical concern. They experience something where their finances are interrupted and they become unhoused. And then they're able to get some support, go into a homeless service agency, enter what we call, like maybe in the United States, what we call a rapid rehousing program, which is a program that provides services for a short period of time, 3 months or less. And they're not really wraparound services. They're more financial services. So they're not like services related to health or well-being or anything like that. It's simply job related and financial. And they're able to get on their feet and keep going. That is not tend to be where OTs intervene. It is in chronic homelessness where OTs are really needed. So chronic homelessness is actually the most costly and the most common form of homelessness. This is sort of the image that I think you conjure in your head when you think of someone who is unhoused. And it is an individual who has a physical or mental disability and has experienced 4 or more periods of homelessness in 1 year, or at least 1 year of complete homelessness. So it's that overlap of they have a disability and they're homeless. So this is our individual who has chronic mental illness and is experiencing homelessness. And so it's about 30% of the homeless population globally. And so the reason that this matters is because we know that mental illness decreases cognition. Repeat episodes of psychosis, if you have untreated mental illness, damages your brain's ability to come back to baseline cognitive functioning. So every time you have that repeat psychosis episode, you're not quite coming back to your typical level of cognitive functioning. So over time, you're going to have a result in decreased cognition. We know substance use results in decreased cognition. And what we also know from recent studies is that the unhoused population, 50% have a traumatic brain injury from violence on the streets, from interactions with law enforcement. And so when we're thinking about just those more medical model things, we know that there's a decrease on cognition. And then we've done some other studies around sleep, and we found that individuals in this population only sleep around 4 hours each night. And so when we start thinking about the cognitive abilities that are occurring in this population and the sort of existence of programming to support people who are unhoused, there is a mismatch. We're saying that the way to solve homelessness is to plunk people down in homes, but that's not the case. It's those supportive services, it's OT, right, that we have to bridge that gap. Because if you don't have the ability to engage in the independent living skills, being placed in an apartment isn't going to help you if you don't know how to grocery shop, how to cook, how to pay your bills. Even if you do have a job, you're not going to be able to do those other tasks. And so we're going to talk a little bit about OT's role, but that's why chronic homelessness becomes such an important role for OT. So occupation itself, not OT, but occupation. So we know that homelessness results in limited opportunities to engage in meaningful occupations. When you are unhoused, you spend the majority of your time in resource-seeking occupations. So these are occupations that you must do in order to survive. Being unhoused is a great example of Maslow's hierarchy, right? The pyramid that Maslow has of our needs, and the bottom part of that pyramid: food, shelter, clothing, the basic needs, and then above that, safety and psychological safety. If you are spending your entire life in those categories, there isn't any available time, energy, brain space to move beyond that, to self-actualization, community engagement, anything like that. So we know already that the occupations that these individuals participate in are severely limited. And then when they do have those needs met, so when they're able to enter a shelter, and so, let's say that they're able to enter a shelter and the shelter has a 90-day limit, the shelter itself has limits on the amount of occupational participation. So in many shelters, I've been in shelters where they say well, we don't want them to stay here during the day, so we're not going to turn the television on, or we're not going to have books because we wouldn't want them to stay here. One of the first shelters that I engaged with, I wanted to do a community garden, and they said, well, we wouldn't want people to come back and want to tend to that garden, so absolutely not. And that's just such a backwards way of thinking about occupation, right? And so it's those things that we're seeing in a shelter. They're the intention of the shelter operators is the idea that well, we want people to leave the shelter during the day, to go out into the community, to seek work, to seek engagement. But we sort of need to meet those 4 essential areas of occupation. So we need to obtain our physical needs. So if we're in a shelter, maybe we can do that one. To maintain health, to cultivate new skills, and then to advance personal and societal growth. So when we think about the occupational needs of individuals who are experiencing homelessness, it's really about ensuring that 1 and 2 are met, right? So that they have their ability to have health, that they have their physical needs met. And then we really want to start working on those 3 and 4, right? The ability to cultivate new skills and to advance personal growth and societal growth. And so if we had had the ability to create a garden, for example, there would have been a new skill taught that might have been transferable to a job, to their own apartment where they could have grown maybe some herbs. But also, couldn't they have taught that skill to other people coming into the shelter? And then those individuals could have then continued the garden. And so that's a way to give back and a way for them to feel like they're contributing to the future of society. So there was a lot there that I think that needed to be explained. And then obviously as OTs, we all know that lack of engagement in meaningful occupation results in decreased health outcomes, social interactions, and well-being. And so that is why we have such a role here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. We've sort of talked about it, but barriers to engagement in occupation is in this population. Housing, obviously, but transportation, health literacy, and literacy in general. I have done a little bit around literacy, but one of the interesting things is, so the organization that we work with gets a lot of donations. And one day they got a donation of a bunch of reader glasses, just sort of like the magnifying readers. They didn't have a specific prescription to them. And they brought them to the OT clinic and they were like, could you all use this? They were gone in an hour. Every single one of our clients wanted those. And like, we haven't been able to get a donation since. So just examples like functional literacy, vision, skill building opportunities, and then outside of OT, nutritious food, healthcare, government assistance, all of those sort of like systematic issues that we know about. All right. So OT itself, what do we do in the population of individuals experiencing homelessness? The same thing we do everywhere else, right? So activity analysis. So absolutely, we're looking at the occupations, but it's always in the context of being unhoused. And that's one of the main things that I have learned in my time working with this population is, so for example, if we're going to be teaching healthy eating, it's not going to be necessarily at the grocery store because that's not where my clients are going. We have done a lot of work around what's the best thing that we can get at McDonald's for $5? What is the thing that is going to meet the majority of your nutritional needs at this fast food restaurant for $5? Or one of my favorite groups is we gave everybody in the group $5. And there was a gas station across the street and a grocery store like maybe a block down. And we told everyone to go and get a snack. It had to be a drink and a food item. And you had $5. And then they came back. And we asked them, like, well, what did you get and why did you get it? And it was a really interesting comparison because the people who went to the grocery store got like an energy bar and, a soda. And the people who went to the grocery store got like a box of microwave popcorn and maybe like, a couple waters or something like that. And we were able to talk about like the volume that you can get, even though it's only 1 block away, same amount of money, right? So it's the context that's so important. So being able to do environmental analysis, activity analysis, task analysis is so essential. And we are the only folks who do that. So we know that there's a lot on supported employment, community resources. We do a lot of health and wellness work. All of the things that we see in mental health OT are absolutely essential in this population. It's just also the addition of the context. So I just want to show you a little bit. This is where I have been providing my services. So this is the Biddle House Opportunity Center. It's part of St. Patrick's Center here in St. Louis, Missouri in the United States, where we provide services. This is our OT service organization. And so I just had to show you some lovely pictures of the people and the places that I have been working with. So this is the bread and butter of what we're going to talk about today. So one of the things in working with this population that we very, very quickly realize is there are a lot of occupations that people participate in that are not necessarily sanctioned by society. And because OTs are part of society, we have historically not sanctioned them in our practice. And I always start this is not specific to the unhoused population. Everyone, everywhere participates in occupations that are not sanctioned by society. Substance use is prevalent across different levels of society, right? So is engaging with law enforcement, all of these things completely prevalent across different levels of society. We were just really seeing it in this population, because I think they found it less taboo and a little bit more okay to talk about. And so as OTs, we really felt the need to address this, because if we didn't, we were not seeing a full occupational view of our clients. And so I wanted to give you two definitions here. So on the left side of your screen, you're seeing a definition from Twinley. On the right side, you're seeing a definition from Nikki Kepek. So Rebecca Twinley calls them the dark side of occupations, meaning like the dark side of the moon, meaning not typically acknowledged, not typically seen, not typically addressed. It has nothing to do with anything related to like the color dark or anything like that. This is how she describes it to me. And so she calls them the things that some people do that may not always promote good health, may not always be productive, yet may provide a sense of well-being. And then Nikki Kepek calls them non-sanctioned occupations. And Nikki describes them as occupations that within historically and culturally bound contexts tend to be viewed as unhealthy, illegal, immoral, abnormal, undesired, unacceptable, and or appropriate. And so here's the thing. These are like things that we don't like to talk about, but they're essential to our clients' lives. And they may not necessarily bring about health, but they bring about well-being. And I think the prime example, cigarette smoking. There are so many people in the world who for cigarette smoking is a massive coping skill, particularly a population of individuals with serious mental illness. As we know, is in the United States, is one of the largest percentages of population still smoking cigarettes. And yet it doesn't promote health, but it promotes well-being. And so actually psychiatrists have started to recognize that maybe they should stop like promoting smoking cessation when clients do not want to, because they were seeing an increase in psychiatric behaviors. And so we have to recognize that some of these things do contribute to the well-being in the client's lives, and thus implement a harm reduction frame on them. And so we'll talk about this in a minute. So non-sanctioned occupations often result in occupational injustices because participation in non-sanctioned occupations may result in occupational marginalization or occupational alienation, and may then result in being unhealthy. So we talked about this a little bit, but basically, if we ignore these, we do not have a good understanding of our individual. I always say, if you are doing a budgeting activity with your client, and your client is a substance user, there's no way you can have a good budget if you're not budgeting for the substance that they are using. And I think that's a prime example. So let's have that conversation. I would rather us have a conversation about budgeting for alcohol or whatever it may be, and then use a harm reduction frame, than not include it at all and not even know about it and wonder why this budget that we put together isn't working every week, right? So as we began to work with this population, we really needed to know how to look at their occupational participation, how to assess their occupational participation. And we looked at the activity cards, which was put together by Dorothy Edwards and Carolyn Baum. And it was a great option because there were pictures and it was tangible, but the occupations in it were not what our clients were doing. And the pictures themselves were not representative of our clients. This was for a community, older adult community dwelling population. So like I always say, the picture of reading was an older adult sitting in a leather armchair with this leather bound book and a cat. And like my clients would never relate to that. They don't see themselves in that picture. And so I had a bunch of conversations with Carolyn Baum about how can we make that more what we need and what we're going to do. So we went through a process, and there's a full article that I've linked to you in your resource page about everything that we did for this. We talked to clients, we talked to practitioners working in this population, and we created a new assessment that included the occupations that this population participates in. And we added a title called Advancing Inclusive Participation. Each word in this title represents the focus of the tool. Advancing recognizes the dynamic nature of occupation, how it interacts with culture and society, and that the active role that both the client and the participant and the OT are playing in reducing the stigma around these occupations as we're working with them. Participation is what we're doing as we're engaging in it. And then inclusive, because it is inclusive of all occupations, but also that the pictures are not pictures, but rather line drawings. So as I said, we struggled with how do we represent as many people as possible. And the way that we decided to do that was not with pictures, but with line drawings. So we took pictures, and then I had an amazingly talented student who hand drew all 72 of these, I believe. And they were purposely drawn to demonstrate an action, but also to be ambiguous of gender, of sex, of as much context as possible. So you can see here, washing dishes, preventing pregnancy and infection. And some of these are really tricky. Some of them we spent hours discussing how do you depict that in a picture, using public transit, finding drugs and alcohol, taking care of family, and managing medication. Managing medication I show purposely because this picture was of a Caucasian female, but we purposely have changed the facial features, the hair of this individual to try to make it as ambiguous as possible. Everyone is going to put their own views and their own thoughts on this individual, but this was our attempt to change it as much as possible. I don't think it's in here, but I have sleeping, and sleeping is essentially a person with something under their head and something over them. It's very purposely looks like that. It doesn't look like a bed. It doesn't look like a shelter bed, right? It doesn't look like a bedroom. Very, very purposefully, so that people can see themselves in this iteration. These are the sorting options. So things like never did, do now. And then we have these cards of do prior to, but don't want to do, and didn't do, but want to do. And the blank spaces, so you could say did prior to substance use, did prior to homelessness, did prior to mental illness, did prior to now, right? You can fill in what it is that you are, what the time point is. Did prior to OT services, whatever it is that you want to look at, you have the ability to fill that in. One of the things that we really wanted with this was to make it a super user-friendly tool. There's follow-up questions on the back. This was something that we learned when I first started working with this population. There was a lot I learned in how to ask questions in a way that was going to get you at the information that you wanted. And so we provide those questions that are there to help you deepen the conversation. They're at a cognitive level. This client understands. They are at a way so that you can, have that conversation without having to have all the knowledge of the context if you are new to working in this population. And so, like I said, non-sanctioned occupations do not just occur in our, low socioeconomic status groups. They occur across the board. Everyone participates in non-sanctioned occupations. And actually, the study that we did on the pilot study of this, we found that that was one of the true things, that it was not that people differed in the participation, but how they did it, the participation was different. So how do we address them? We use harm reduction. We want to lessen the harm that the activity has on the person in the community. So, for example, how can we reduce the amount that you're spending on this? How can we make it slightly better for you? Can we implement a coping skill in addition to smoking that cigarette? One of the things that is a harm reduction at a population health level is filters on cigarettes is harm reduction that's at a very high population level. Obviously, we can't put that in, but that's an example. We want to recognize the benefit that this occupation may have to the individual. I think we are so quick to put our judgments of who we are and our identities on our clients, but it's so important for us to stop to say, okay, like what are the benefits that this gives to someone? So if my client's saying like I drink a beer every night to fall asleep, my first thought is going to be, oh, stop doing that. But if their option is, well, then I don't sleep because the shelter environment is so poor. Well, would I rather this person gets a good amount of sleep and have one beer? Thinking about the flip side of that, it's just a different way of us thinking about health and well-being and our practice. We want to design interventions to reduce the harm without removing the occupation. And this is where you have to be crafty. This is where you have to work with the client. I had a client who was very morbidly obese. He had a lot of issues at the shelter. He kept getting threatened to get kicked out. And he was not interested in any sort of interventions around like weight loss or anything like that. And so our first step was like, I want you to just write down what you eat every day. Like, let's start there. Like, and just being able to think about it. I was like, I don't want to change anything you're doing. I just want us to start thinking about food. And like, he was willing to do that. And then, you know, our other thing was like, we're just going to try to walk to the bus stop. And none of those were changing anything that he was doing, right? But they were a means to an end. And when you can start with a harm reduction framework, eventually you can maybe get that occupation changed, and maybe they don't. But it's the idea that you can lessen the harm that is happening. We want to advocate for the client with others who want to limit participation. So when you're on a treatment team and someone else says they have to stop smoking or they have to stop using that drug, why? Like, why do they need to do that? You know, is there a better option? Is there something else they can do instead? We sometimes have to be that voice. And then communicate without judgments or bias. Aim to learn and aim to listen. Let me tell you, I've been doing this work with the in-house population for about 8 years now, and I have learned so much. I have been schooled so many times and put in my place, and every time I'm happy to learn it, and the clients know that. And so I think, you know, even coming into that work with that sort of open heart and those open ears is really important. Okay, so that's my presentation portion.
Well, thank you so much, Quinn. That was a lot of information, but for me, being in pediatrics, it was just all new information. So thank you so much for that. Do you want to go ahead and move to your case study presentation for us?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, questions. That's a good idea. I didn't
Oh,
see
yes.
any questions, just so you know, in the chat box that came up. But as Quinn is going through the case study, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and just put them in the chat box. And Quinn, from what I saw, 13 countries here today so far. So from faces and names I recognize, just so you know. All right, go ahead and take it over.
All right. So our case study today is Mike. Mike is a 24-year-old male who has had falling out with his mother, with whom he has been living. And this is very common. I see this quite regularly. As a result, Mike is now living on the street. So when you meet Mike, he reports that he's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder as the result of abuse during his childhood. He reports peripheral neuropathy in his bilateral lower extremities. He ambulates with a cane, but demonstrated the ability to safely navigate the building, including stairs, with modified independence. Mike reports that he drinks frequently to stop the pain and uses drugs when he can to help him sleep. Upon admit, Mike demonstrated limited knowledge of insight into his psychiatric and medical diagnoses. He demonstrates a positive attitude, a high level of motivation to improve his living situation, and fair interpersonal skills. Mike demonstrates limited independent living experience, strained family relationships, poor coping, and emotional management skills. When asked about his goals, Mike states that he would like to get a job, improve his relationship with his family, and take better care of himself. So our sort of guiding questions as you think through this is I really want us to think of, like, one, how might you use the activity card? So what kind of questions would you ask? Would you use it as an assessment? Do you want to use it maybe as a intervention planning tool? How can you use it? What other assessments would you want to do with Mike, whether they be mental health or physical rehab? You know, what areas of occupation would you want to address? And then thinking from this idea of our non-sanctioned occupations, our harm reduction, how would we address this substance use issue with Mike?
All right. Well, thank you so much. Kelsey is going to break us all into breakout rooms, and the facilitators will go through the questions with each of you.
Okay. Do we have everyone back, Kate? I can't see the participant numbers anymore because I have too many. Everyone's back? Okay. Sounds good. So we're going to start going over the case study. So I'm going to be calling on the groups, and the facilitators will start to mention some of the things that you guys have brought up. Just to quickly go over, we'll start with the first question. How might you use the ACS-AIP with Mike during his session? And we can start with Aika's group. if she's in here. I actually can't see participants.
Aika, do you want to go first?
There she is.
Can I go the other question, please?
Do you want to talk about the assessments?
Oh, this question was hard.
Sorry, say that again. Your connection
We
cut out.
discussed all the questions, but question number 1 was very hard for us.
Okay, it was in the
We
group
did
that I
not know how
was
to
too.
go about it.
It was
So we
the
just had.
last. I agree. In the group
I
that
said we discussed all the questions.
Okay. Did anyone answer question 1? You can unmute if you did. For any of the groups.
We answered it.
Okay. Yes, we did. So I'll just say for our group, what we thought for using this might be a good starting point to build rapport, and the use of visuals kind of help describe the dark occupations and some of the things that you might not typically think of. Think of any other. Sarah or David, did your group say anything for the first one?
The first thing our group said was that it was a completely new area of treatment for them, so they were unfamiliar with it. But they did say basically just present the cards to the client and see which ones are most relevant to them.
Okay. Good job.
Really nice discussion just on how the card sort, even if not used in the past, could really open up for more conversation for what interests are for future employment. Also as a rapport builder, that sort of thing as well. He's interested in work. So also getting a sense of just what interest for that. And that can be done with the activity cards, so it can also be done with conversation. But it's a really nice icebreaker.
Very nice. Okay, so we'll move on in the sense for time for the assessments. Let's switch to Poteen's group. Did you guys get to that one?
We did, and we tried to go through the question. And the first question, we tried to come up with how we can use the activity card sort, and try to come up with kind of steps that normally you have to go through it. And the first step we normally have to come up first is to prepare the activity card sorts with the various activities and exercises based on the preference of the client. And then later on, we introduce the concept of the activity, and we have to communicate with the client, and the mic, with the purpose of doing those activities. And the third one was sorting the cards based on the preference of the clients. And we later on we were like, we have to discuss the results later before we go ahead with the planning of the activity we have to do with the clients. And that's the fifth one, is to create a plan based on the client's preferences. And thereafter we start from the first to, the first thing that a client needs to work on to the least one that the client needs to focus on. That's what we try to discuss on the first question. And the second question was about I think we had that we have to first deal with the first question that can go to the other question. So, and the assessment we tried, because he's more focused on job and family. So the assessment to identify they might be using, we come up with more host, which can be more of the motivation, the interest of the activity the client needs to work on, so they can be able to come up with which activity do we think can be perfect to meet the needs of Mike. And I think we also mentioned COPEM, which can also be a great fit to come up with in the line with how we can use the activity card sort. So that's what we try to work on, both the first and second questions. And
Good.
then
Yep.
maybe,
So
we
we're
can
just
go
gonna
ahead with
quickly. Good. So you guys said a
Yeah.
host and a few others. We're just going to quickly go through some of the other groups so that they have some time to go through some of them too. Antonios, did your group have anything else for assessments and any occupations that you'd want to address?
Well, apart from checking the range of motion and muscle strength, we suggested giving the adult sensory profile, just checking for the sensory issues that they might be.
Okay, very nice. And did your group identify any type of occupations?
Just as areas, would say ADLs and IADLs,
Mhm.
and maybe using as a pre-vocational training.
Good.
Something like meal preparation if he's going to work in a station where he would prepare food.
Very good. Okay, let's see. We'll go back to Aika. We'll go, do you have any more areas of occupations that you guys discussed?
So we discussed on the ADLs, assessing, working on the IADLs, working on the leisure part, social participation, and work. Those are the areas we discussed that we could work on.
Good job.
Mike.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we're going to switch now to the last question because you guys highlighted a lot of the areas of occupation. How might you plan to address these issues of substance abuse? Let's start with David's group.
The first suggestion was trying to get him involved in some physical activity that might help him be tireder and therefore sleep better.
Mhm.
The other area was trying to get involved in, and that would depend on what the shelter offered, basketball, whatever. The second area was trying to get him involved in some sort of drug rehab program. Those are the two suggestions from my group.
Good job. Antonius, what about your group?
Well, actually, to be honest, we didn't have a finding in this question because nobody of us worked with homeless people before. So those using substance users. So we said that we might talk with the medical doctors and maybe they suggest something pharmaceutically.
Okay, good. I can just quickly go over some things that our group did bring up is just kind of just general education on substance use, using motivational interviewing to see if they're willing to look at that portion of their life and if they're willing to try other things. They talked about relaxation strategies and then also some like emotion management as well. Okay. That was all the questions, and we finished right at 3 o'clock.
Great. And Quinn has an announcement for us.
I did want to let you know, and I'll the link is in the resource page, and I'll put it again in the chat. So the assessment is available for free. It's open access on my school WashU's website. You can download it. It does ask for your email address because we are doing some information gathering. So we might ask you what you think of using it, if there's any changes you want about it. I'm going to put the website here in the chat. It's also on the resource page for you, but it is completely free to download the entire assessment for you.
Thank you so much. That is so exciting that this is a new free tool that everyone can use. And thank you so much, Quinn, for coming on today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was lovely to meet you all.